guys, it's Street Pilots. Welcome back to part 3 of the install of the forks. So you watched part 1 when we removed them, watch part 2 how we change our fork oil, and here's part 3 of how we throw them back in. And it's pretty straightforward. It's the reverse of taking them out, but I wanted to give a huge shout out to Cold War Customs for giving us these awesome metal fork gaiters, which we're going to install back on our forks. So the forks, pretty simple to install. You wiggle them back in through your tree clamps. Your left side will have the brake caliper mounting, and your right side will have the bigger opening for the axle shaft, so you can't mix it up. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to slip over our fork gaiter to preemptively position it. Next, using some WD-40 or some oil penetrant, I'm going to quickly lube the tree clamps just so that it's easier to wiggle this in. And now it's just a little bit of patience and some elbow grease. So spray some WD-40 penetrant on your tree clamps, and then for me, I'm going to use a flathead screwdriver to wedge them a little bit open, just so pulling them back in is going to be much easier. So hang tight. And just like that, one is back in, and now we're going to get the second one back in. So again, use a little bit of a penetrant or WD-40 to wet your clamps. And then I use a small flathead screwdriver to wedge it open just a hair, and so that we can put these back in with ease. There. A bit of a wedge. And now, if you remember the markings we have at the top or the measurements we took, we can wiggle these into their respective place. So that's it. It's just that easy. With your forks in place and your gaiters preset, now we can tighten everything on so that it holds its position, and then we can throw the wheel back in. Tighten in your forks just to hold them snug as we reassemble everything so that they don't slip and don't change their position. We will torque them at the end. So with your forks back in place, snug, but not torqued down, it's time to put the wheel back in. So since we took the axle shaft out, I mean, you might still have grease on it from last time. Here's a good habit. Get some axle grease and just grease up your shaft. With your axle shaft greased, you can put it back in, and you may have to wiggle your wheel to get everything back to being lined up. With the axle shaft in this place, let's begin getting it snug. With everything snug, now we're going to put the caliper on, and then after the caliper is on, we're going to go through and torque all of our fork bolts, including the axle shaft and the pinch bolt. Get your caliper off of its hanging support so that you weren't hanging it by its brake lines. And now this is also a good time to check your thickness of your brake pads. Mine are still quite healthy. So without further ado, we are going to slip it back on. There you go. Just that easy. And then we're gently going to secure it in place for now until we go through and torque everything. So at this point, you're almost done. Now it's just important that we torque the axle shaft, the pinch bolt, the 2 caliper bolts, and we go up and we torque every tree clamp bolt that we took off. With everything assembled, now you can put on your fork gaiters and you can tighten them. The fork gaiters will have a set screw, and for cleanliness purposes, we're going to set the set screw to the back and the opening towards the interior, towards the fender. And it'll be reversed on the opposite side with the set screw also at the back. So tighten this on now. With everything else reassembled and torqued, it's time to install the fender. And now we're going to do another sponsored install from Cold War Customs with a badass old school fender. Check that puppy out. Tighten that puppy on. The one that I got was not supplied with nuts for the back of these M8 by 1.25 bolts, so you may have to get 4 nuts to secure it down. on the brackets, they did supply bolts, but not the ones that held your stock fender. So I'm reusing stock fender bolts, but I had to put on nuts on the back. So tighten it down and you're good to go. So last most important piece, let's go over some torque values. So the axle shaft is going to be at 53 foot-pounds. The pinch bolt for the axle shaft is going to be at 18 foot-pounds. Now, moving up the forks, all of your tree clamp bolts are going to be at 18 foot-pounds. Your handlebar bolts are going to be at 22 foot-pounds if you had touched these. And then your brake caliper bolts will be at 35 foot-pounds.